Okay, I think we're recording. We're on the air. We are live at this moment, although we won't be live when this gets out. So welcome to the show that has no name because this is not a Q&A. And I am your host, Panyo Basa, and this is our special honored guest, Stevens.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Greetings to everyone out there.
Yeah.
Great to be back as always.
And Halloween's coming up, All Hallows Eve. And it has been sort of a little tradition of short standing of mine to do some Halloween themed video before Halloween, talking about ghosts and witches and so forth. But I've already talked about those. So Stevens and I are going to talk about something that's even spookier from a modern perspective, and that is transhumanism. And probably we're also going to get into the technological singularity to some degree. And I mean, when I first read about the technological singularity in an article, and it was like some blog called Wait But Why, something like that. And when I first was exposed to the very idea of the technological singularity, I mean, it just haunted me. Seriously, I mean, it was just really like a spooky, creepy kind of an idea that would not go away for many days. And transhumanism is sort of bound up with the technological singularity because, it's sort of, a lot of it is the same sort of research and like technology that is being worked on, I suppose. And you've been wanting to talk about transhumanism. I noticed you did a YouTube video on your channel about transhumanism already. So I thought we'd talk about it and just creep out the viewers to the best of our ability.
Yeah, it's something really interesting that I always love talking about. How old were you when you first heard about the singularity, and where were you? I'm curious to know.
I was at a Burmese Theravada Buddhist monastery in, let's see, where was it? Fremont, California, back around 2015 or so. So it's been, I mean,
fairly recently then.
Yeah, fairly recently. I mean, there was no real concept of it. I was never exposed to it like before I became a monk, and then 30 years in Burmese forests. I mean, they have no concept at all in Burma of the technological singularity or of transhumanism for that matter.
Yes.
I mean, to some degree, transhumanism has been around for a long time, just to the extent that we've got like artificial prosthesis, like pacemakers or artificial hearts, and even like false teeth or a glass eye, something like that. Just like artificial additives. But I mean, it's really taking off in strange directions.
Yeah, when there's some people that say, well, we can trace transhumanism all the way back to ancient Greece, things like that. The idea that man could somehow become blended with technology, that there could be some sort of magical technology that could become a part of him, like some sort of weapon, for example, or some sort of just prosthesis that he's able to attach to himself, although they couldn't envision certainly what we have today. But they did have the idea of deus ex machina, the idea that there is this sort of ghost inside of a very basic machine. Like they had machines that would open up the temple doors when you would light a fire and things like that. And so they could conceive of this idea that there's somehow...
Those could make artificial organisms, like Athena's mechanical owl, for example.
Mm-hmm. So they had a sort of almost spiritual inclination or intuition, rather, that there could be this kind of mythic idea of a ghost in the machine, of a god that comes out of the machine or is generated sort of out of nothing, as this kind of animating force to it. And I think today we still have that idea sort of inherent in us, and this secularized society offers plenty of space for that to start to manifest itself. And we're definitely seeing that today. There is this desire in human beings, I think, to fulfill their inherently mythic needs, and the need for religion, the need for a solution to all of the existential problems that we face beyond just existentialism itself, which doesn't really give you a solution. It sort of just creates more problems and says, well, you have to become the Superman. Well, that's a very tall order. And it's a lot easier to become the Superman if you can, for example, do what sort of, Giorgiani suggests, which is create this kind of magico-religious technology that allows you to transcend yourself in some way and to recreate culture in a way which is retrofuturistic and blends all of the ancient myths and the ancient world together with this modern technology that we're unable to break free from and that we can't escape from. And so the accelerationists and the transhumanists give us these sort of two choices, which is, keep going along the path that we're going and become assimilated into technology, and possibly have the world be destroyed in the process, or jump full speed off of this technological cliff by accelerating everything to the maximum possible extent, politically, technologically, and so forth, to try and move into post-humanity, what they call post-humanity, as quickly as possible, in the hopes that something will come out of it and allow us to survive without destroying the world. But either way, this is a very sort of grim prognosis that involves the end of everything, the end of the known as we know it. The first time I heard about it was Terence McKenna, actually talking about the singularity back in the 90s.
Yeah, it seems unlikely that we're going to be just voluntarily going back to horses and buggies without some collapse of technological civilization. But before we get any farther with this, I assume we should define for the viewers what transhumanism is.
Yeah.
You'd probably be able to give a more coherent answer to that than I could.
I suppose so. There are many definitions of it, but I think a good place to start is the idea of blurring the boundaries of what was formerly considered the human being with non-human entities, with machines, with animals, with pretty much anything that involves going above or beyond the human in a conventional sense, not really in the sense of the Superman or an existential sense so much, although that gets sort of blended in some cases. But really, we're talking about transcending the human being, or the idea of the human being as being inherently limited, that there's something wrong with human nature, something flawed and imperfect and fallen about human nature, almost in the way that you would see in religion.
Yeah,
but that this can be corrected by moving out of or through or into post-humanity. And in the process, we have to sort of become transhuman, which involves this idea of this sort of evaporation or thinning out of the boundaries that define the human being as a discrete entity, and the kind of liminal merging with the human and the other. That's, I think, the best way to describe it. And usually that involves merging with technology.
Yeah, so transhuman literally would just be beyond human. And that would be within the modern or postmodern context. It's merging humans with like computers or like this is when I was first exposed to the idea of the technological singularity. This is, almost 10 years ago, I think. I'm reading about how even then they are already developed artificial blood that works much better than our blood. You can hold your breath for 2 or 3 hours, for example, just because it stores oxygen better than hemoglobin and so forth. And so the question just arises, if you can have blood that's so much better so that you can hold your breath for 2 or 3 hours, why not? And then, it doesn't, to some degree, there's all different ways you could go about it. I've read a lot of science fiction. I've read about science fiction that was definitely transhuman. It's like there was Greg Bear wrote this series of novels. I can't remember the name of them, but it was like he wrote them a long time ago, but it was well into transhumanism, where you had sort of like the like the Luddites or just the people who just stubbornly refused to like change shape. You know, they refused to have artificial additives. You know, they were just going to stay biological humans. And then you had people that, I mean, you could still call them people, I guess, but I mean, they could just assume like a sphere. You know, they're just like a sphere physically, and you know, they augmented intelligence and all this kind of stuff. It's I mean, it's really mind blowing if you think about the possibility of it, and it is theoretically possible that we could just completely modify ourselves. But it does seem more likely to me that like if they really wanted to just go completely beyond humanity, it's sort of it'd be like downloading your personality into a supercomputer, and then you've got like the virtual reality, and you don't have to eat, you don't have to breathe air. I mean, that would be almost what you're talking about before we started recording about Buckminster Fuller saying that, you know, you'll be able to do everything with nothing. It's like, so long as you've got, you know, the minimal amount of electricity to keep the computer going, you've got this entire world. I mean, you can pick what kind of world you want to live in. You know, you want to live in ancient Rome or some, you know, completely fictional kind of, you know, society. You want to live in like Plato's Republic or something. I mean, that would be an option. And I mean, you wouldn't need to eat. You wouldn't get sick. You know, it'd be almost like being in a Buddhist heaven realm. And there, I mean, there'd be no old age or death necessarily unless somehow the computer gets turned off or crashes or whatever. So I think it's possible. And in fact, I've heard one answer to the what was the guy who was saying, why is there no life? Why do we see no life in the universe? What's that? I can't remember what it's called.
Fermi's paradox.
Yeah, Fermi's paradox. And one answer to that is that this is what happens to civilizations that become technologically advanced enough, is they just download themselves into a computer and just live in this, you know, enclosed reality.
Yes.
Because I mean, in a way, it would be superior in that, you know, you don't have to eat, you don't get sick, you don't get old, just on and on and on. And it's a virtual reality, but then again, from like a Buddhist point of view, the reality we're living in right now is a virtual reality. I mean, we're already in the Matrix to some degree, but still, it is kind of unsettling, and I think I might elect to become just a Luddite that refuses to accept the artificial blood and the brain implants, you know, become bionic or whatever.
Yeah. It's very much like Brave New World as well. And linking that in there, you know, Huxley got the outline for that from the social engineers of the Anglo-American establishment and what they were really trying to do. You know, H.G. Wells was a famous social engineer who was associated with all this stuff. He wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, and he was also a sci-fi writer. And so there is this idea that such things are possible, and not only possible, but they're planned. And we're certainly a good part of the way there. Francis Fukuyama, in Our Post-Human Future, talks about, for example, the augmentation of the human being with Adderall and Ritalin, and how in certain areas of society you will have like 40% or more of children under, I think, like 5 years old even on Ritalin and Adderall. I was put on Ritalin when I was 6 years old, actually 6 or 7 years old, and this was solely to like enhance my performance as an, you know, academic person in school at 6 or 7 years old, right? And so the question is, well, where is the boundary there between doing that, for example, and using, say, nanomachines or something like that that could perpetually stimulate these areas of my brain, or that I could turn, you know, flip a switch on and off and kind of like turn them on and go. And it creates this kind of tremendous moral hazard where we start doing very small things and they can quickly sort of spiral out of control into much larger things. And this is why Kaczynski thought that, well, the best idea is to try and stop this thing from developing before it gets out of hand. Because the way the system works, he uses terms like the system's neatest trick and things like that. And one of these tricks that the system uses is it provides this disproportionately great reward for anyone who's able to develop a small piece of this all-encompassing technological empire or virtual reality that's building up around us. And it sort of dilutes the moral culpability amongst all of us at the same time. And because if we don't develop it, someone else will, inevitably, then we just all go ahead and push towards this thing as much as we can, and we all fit all of these pieces together. We're producing more and more human beings who have more and more ideas, and they learn more quickly, and the information is sped up. And since the infotech revolution, it's been like, in some way, the Reformation all over again. It's like the digital Reformation, where now we are able not just to use this printing press, but to use this just hyper digital transfer of information that just exponentially speeds up learning, knowledge, development, and so on. And
Yeah,
so
back when I was haunted by right when I just found out about the technological singularity and about how a majority of computer experts are persuaded that it's going to be happening within the next few decades, whether we like it or not. I watched this documentary about AI and like these people that are pioneering it, and they're just giddy. I mean, they're just drunk with the idea of creating superhuman intelligence. And there's this one guy, he was taking live brain cells from a rat and somehow attaching them to computer chips and then teaching the computer chips to do tricks using like living brain tissue as part of the whole system. And yeah, I mean, it's like a one-way street. Like technological advancement is going to keep going until technological civilization collapses from one cause or another. And if we don't do it, of course, the Chinese might, even some computer genius in North Korea might invent the first super AI, and it's like the Western countries can't allow that to happen. So it's we're already getting to the point where warfare it's going to be like miniature drones like this big that are looking for one person in particular, just taking him out surgically, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. There have been ideas, for example, posited by Heidegger, that what he calls techne is a metaphysical force that precedes science. It is in some way metaphysically necessary. It's a metaphysical force in the universe which works with us, works with living beings to kind of further manifest itself. And that there is this telos to this thing called techne, that as history proceeds down this path of progress, that this telos, this inevitability, kind of builds and leads towards something, kind of in the same way that Hegel talks about, spirit, Geist, knowing itself, and then we reach ultimately this point of ultimate freedom in which everything has total freedom of movement. We move towards this manifestation where techne has a revealing. It shows itself through the technology that we develop, and we begin to communicate with it as the other, as it then moves back into us and colonizes the human being, colonizes the human body, merges with and annihilates the God in a way that it created it, and the creation transcends creator. In the same way that you see the idea of Victor Frankenstein, and the subtitle of that, as I said before, that novel originally was The Modern Prometheus. The idea of bringing this fire to man in a way that can make him into a god, and in fact transcend the creators themselves. So the creation transcends creator, and that's why Giorgiani has named the book Prometheism, is because the idea of Prometheus is the God of the West who was originally worshipped to begin the Faustian project. And the Faustian project, if we go back to Plato, is the idea of delineating the forms out of the flux that Heraclitus talks about. Plato was a disciple of a guy named Cratylus, who in turn was a disciple of Heraclitus. And so Plato knew about the flux, and he wanted to create the forms, Giorgiani says at least, as this kind of noble lie so that he could typify aspects of reality and then begin to study them through empiricism, or what would ultimately become empiricism, empirical observation. And this is the beginning of the West's project of the world model to reduce everything into a quantifiable series of metrics and equations, and to create viable models that it can use to simulate aspects of reality, to test, and then to ultimately recreate reality by changing the code in and of itself, and to change the idea of truth away from anamnesis, away from a revealing of the soul, to Descartes' idea of veritas, which is instead perfect representability through language, perfect correspondence through language in the same way that we would get a computer code. And so the computer ultimately is the culmination of the Faustian project of the West that could only have been envisioned or visualized or created by the West, by the Promethean, Faustian way of visualizing reality.
Yeah, it's mostly the West that is trying to seek happiness or the good externally.
Yeah, and it can't
turning within.
It can't
you
see
can actually
things
find perfection within, but if you're looking out at the phenomenal world, then it's, as a general rule, it's not going to happen. Seems to me.
Yeah, well, we changed away from our focus on deduction and metaphysics, and we moved into empiricism, and we moved into induction through the collection and monitoring of facts and figures that we can then generate models out of and insert things into our models. And ultimately, this is the idea of power and control. And Prometheus, of course, he wants to steal the fire from the gods, and this hubris, of course, what ends up happening to him, I think he gets chained to a rock, and they have vultures eating his liver for eternity. But people get the fire, human beings get the fire, and they are able to use it to create this technological world model. And when we move away from deduction, we move away from a priori reasoning, and this idea that we can think about truth internally, and we can kind of like discover things that are metaphysically necessary without having to observe the external world, the external reality. But in the Enlightenment and shortly prior to that, you have people like Hume who come along and say, no, you can't actually do deduction. Deduction, the only thing that happens when we deduce things are we're just making tautologies. So for example, 2 + 2 = 4. He says, well, all you're saying there is just 4 = 4. So all of metaphysics, he says, heretofore, done before me, has to just be thrown out, thrown into the trash can. And then Locke,
a radical skeptic.
He was, yeah. And so he was totally against all that stuff. And we looked at induction, and he says, well, induction actually doesn't really tell us much either. It tells us these patterns, but we have no reason to believe that there's any sort of causal relation between any of them at all.
Yeah. He debunked the whole idea of cause and effect being an obvious fact.
Right. But so we end up going into this idea of that which is most readily apprehendable phenomenally to us. That is to say, the immediacy of our experiences. And as we move more and more into postmodernism, more and more into skepticism and fear and irony, fear about communication, because our linguistic networks are torn free of their contexts. And we ultimately get into this situation of what Derrida calls difference, that basically every node in this linguistic network that's referring to something else, it has to refer outside of the system. But because this text is enclosed, this network is a closed network, everything ultimately becomes recursive and self-referential and meaningless. And so meaning dissolves, But we have this network, which is very much like a computer network, or the idea of a neural network, an AI learning network. And so we're sort of stripped of meaning because of this.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about being stripped of meaning. It's my understanding, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but postmodernism pretty much began with literary criticism and art criticism. And it's like the new criticism where it's like you disregard what the artist was trying to say. And it's just like your own reaction to it is what is like elemental. But
Yeah,
it's like cutting through the communication. It's like an artist, as a general rule, not all artists, especially not modern artists, but as a general rule, an artist is trying to convey a message. And it's like Dostoevsky, like symbolism in a novel, like like any novel by Dostoevsky, or like Lord of the Flies or something. The whole thing is a parable. It's symbolic, and the author obviously had an idea in mind.
yes.
Why Dostoevsky's The Idiot starts in November, for example. It's the 11th month. It's like it's an apocalyptic novel. It's the 11th hour. And it's to just dismiss all that, it really is just uprooting everything and just sort of hamstringing just culture and just verbal knowledge in general.
That's right. Well, you see, in order to derive all of that meaning from Dostoevsky, you have to start with some sort of situated axiomatic knowledge from one of these points. But if you, postmodernism says, you start at some other point in this rhizomatic network, you can draw very different conclusions about it. And in fact, you can ultimately even draw paradoxical conclusions from things, because everything is just this recursive self-referential network, and we're not really saying anything because we can never get outside the text to get context. And this goes into, you mentioned Gödel, like the incompleteness idea. It's kind of like if you were to write on a note card the saying, the saying on the other side of this card is false, and then you flip it over and it says the saying on the other side of this card is true. You just are stuck flipping it over forever, and you never really get a conclusion as to whether it is actually true or false. The system just keeps referring back to itself again, right? And so we end up with this need for immediacy and intensity during and immediately after the Romantic period, where the consequences of the Enlightenment are beginning to be felt. We begin to live in this kind of model world. Locke takes us into this idea that thoughts are generated by stimulus that come in. They stimulate the mind. They're like putting wood on a fire, he says, and then it creates these thoughts out of that wood that it sort of sets ablaze. And so as a result, we begin to think about our interpretations of things as they are coming in and being processed by us in this sort of very materialistic and biological way. And then once later on, the Romantics get a hold of that, they become very sort of disenchanted with it. And then it leads into Nietzsche and the idea that God is dead, because by God, he doesn't just mean the Christian God, he also means the axiomatic centering of knowledge, the privileging of any sort of knowledge center in academia at large. And the Romantics deal with it through escapism and through ennui and through expressing this sort of like naive hope about not nature as such, but a kind of romantic idealized vision of nature that almost becomes a virtual reality in and of itself, becomes a virtual world.
When I was studying Romanticism in college, like in English lit, it was Romanticism. It started off as just like a return to common people, like shepherds, just living, shepherds and farmers, and just like Wordsworth taking a walk through his garden and just writing poetry about a rock he sees in his garden, essentially, which made him boring as hell to teenage readers of his stuff. But I think Romanticism has a scope far beyond what I was taught about it in English.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Frankenstein itself is kind of a romantic idea or romanticist aesthetic or novel. You
Yeah,
mentioned Wordsworth.
wife wrote it.
Wordsworth has a poem that's about this cabin in the woods, which is very famous. And there's an extra sort of piece of that poem where we revisit the cabin and we see that this woman has kind of gone insane with ennui, and the cabin is now sort of overgrown, and there are these fragments of glass everywhere that have been shattered, and we see our sort of pluralistic, schizophrenic kind of reflection in this glass, and we see the moon, which is kind of like this portal to this sort of shattered mind after this psychotic break. That the cabin of the West is in disarray because of this revelation, which has taken meaning away from us and drawn us out into this world of ennui and madness. And then we have the prophets of intensity who come immediately thereafter. Nietzsche, for example, who preaches that we need to be able to exist outside of the forms, outside of the need to delineate one meaning onto everything in this kind of quest for perfect rationality now, because the West is not going to be able to rely on Neoplatonism and on Christendom as it formerly had. And so later on, then you get in the postmodernists the idea that the most immediately apprehendable experience can really be the axiom for our system. Foucault talks about the idea that, well, it's pleasure, actually. Pleasure is what has the most sort of immediacy and meaning to us, and is like an inherent good that we can all look towards for meaning.
Yeah,
and so we begin
that's the principle also. I mean, it's true. It seems to me, just based on my own introspection for years and years, that really it's like that's the only really driving force in us is pleasure of some sort. I mean, the wiser you are, the more subtle and exalted the pleasure is going to be. Just the satisfaction of selflessly serving others,
right?
Self, or like Gandhi, where he'd willingly go to prison and half starve himself and so forth. But I mean, he had such high ideals. He couldn't look at himself in the mirror unless he would rigidly adhere to these ideals of his. So I mean, that was his way of being happy.
Right, but I'm talking about, and that's, as you said, a very sort of subtle, sophisticated pleasure, the pleasure of philosophizing, which affirms our will in this way by helping us create this model. We feel a sense of power, we feel a sense of usefulness and whatnot. But Foucault is really talking about sex, right? And he's talking about the cruder forms of physical hedonic pleasure, and that philosophy ultimately sort of loses its ability to give us that pleasure once meaning becomes sort of disintegrated. And so we begin to look at hedonism then as this new watchword for the Faustian project, because we're now looking strictly at efficiency and utility in everything, and we're trying to find something meaningful through measurement. And so we can always measure the amount of sort of like stimulus or sensory input, or judge, okay, well, this hurts more than that, or this feels better than that. And so we get into this kind of rote need for repetition, which is an addictive quality that Foucault, for example, was very much destroyed by. I mean, he was basically a sex addict who was involved in some of the, I guess you would call them, this is the sort of more, crudest and most extreme homosexual practices, together with extreme, drug usage, methamphetamine, and so on, to try and achieve these states of pleasure in an otherwise meaningless life, meaningless existence. And one is immediately, you see where I'm going with this, the move that I'm making here. We go right back to Brave New World again, like the Feelies. They go into this movie where they put their hands on the seat and they basically are just like shocked with electricity that gives them this orgasmic pleasure. But the problem is that, still devoid of all context, the pleasure that we receive and the pain that we receive are just rote stimulus they're really not as sort of pleasurable as we think. And I think anybody who's been prescribed like an SSRI, for example, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. I was put on Prozac when I was 7 years old also. I don't know how you diagnose a 7-year-old with depression, but you will realize that that is really not happiness, right? Just because you have this kind of forced smile or you have this kind of chemical rush, it really doesn't make you happy, right? You can have like biologically low levels of serotonin and actually feel a sense of satisfaction or happiness in your life. And but in the post-human world, we push towards ever greater and greater levels of stimulation in order to achieve something meaningful. And this is why you see a rise in self-harm, for example, because people just need to feel something real. And if they're in a war or a traffic accident or something like that, a trauma, or they're self-injuring, they are experiencing something that they believe is real for the first time ever.
Yeah, well, I think it's a similar phenomenon in like music or even pornography, where it just has to become more and more just extreme, like the screaming death metal stuff that rock and roll turned into, or just the complete maximum pornography.
Absolutely, and that's the Foucaultian
more and more stimulation just to feel the same high. It's like you build up a tolerance, like with amphetamines or something. And I do think it's like the modern West, especially, it could just be a genetic thing in the European race, but we just have this idea that happiness comes from outside. It's like whether we're happy or not depends on what's going on outside of us, which, I mean, from an Eastern point of view, like a Buddhist point of view, is just obvious bullshit. I mean, it's no matter how much pleasure you experience, there's always going to be an equal amount of its opposite balancing it out. I mean, it's like the heroin addict, he's like in this state of, a kind of pseudo infinity or eternity or whatever it is, this euphoric state. And then he comes down off of it, and it's like the craving and the pain and everything just to get back there. And it's that way with any kind of pleasure. It's, sex addicts, it's just the addictive aspect of it. It's like pain if you don't have it. And so it balances out. And so like the transhumanists, for example, who are trying to make, or just the worshipers of technology who are trying to make life better and better and better, it doesn't work. I mean, it's like, you're just making the pleasures and the pains more subtle. You're eliminating what we used to consider to be bad, which just causes the lower half of what we used to consider good to be like the new bad. Because, it's like the lower half of our experience, which is just practically by definition bad. And it's always going to be that way, and we're never going to eliminate suffering. It's like the first noble truth of Buddhism is if you exist, you suffer.
I had a remarkable realization one time. It's similar to something that U.G. Krishnamurti talks about, which is the idea that, pain and pleasure are delineated by our brain. When we feel certain stimuli, there is an inherent need to move towards it and repeat it, or to move away and to be repulsed by it, to escape from it. But ultimately, once that coding mechanism in the brain breaks down, if you take a large dose of LSD, for example, you will realize that the physical pain and the physical pleasures actually are just a type of pressure, an indeterminate pressure that your brain actually labels as good or bad and moves towards it or away from it. But ultimately, all you're doing is kind of shocking the body or stimulating the body in one way or the other. And this is why U.G. Krishnamurti so ingeniously points out your body doesn't want pleasure either. It doesn't want pain, but it also doesn't want pleasure, because all it's doing is pushing the body out of homeostasis in some way or another, in a way that makes it have to readjust. And the brain, the logical mind, creates this desire for repetition, but the body actually is trying to adjust to it by downregulating everything so that the pleasure that one is experiencing becomes less detrimental to its survival and reproductive capacities. And this is why, for example, when we were a heroin addict, or any such extreme drug like that, the body will make these very strong adjustments that ultimately lead to a withdrawal syndrome when the drug itself is withdrawn. But this is what Foucault sort of looks for, the idea of he's tearing himself apart. He's trying to get to intimacy or closeness with another person by literally having them like touch his organs, by like getting into him, inside of him. But as the Buddha tells us, there's nothing in there. There's nothing in there. You can take every part of the body apart and look for where the soul, the essence, whatever is in there, and it's not in there. And so the search for this is really a misguided search, looking in the wrong place, as you say, for Europeans believing that the happiness is going to be outside, or it's going to be if I can find it somewhere in the body, maybe it's there. And so we've created, as a result, this entire world based around measurement, around quantity, and then looking at utility as economists, for example. I'm studying it here, in Manhattan, economics, and it's very fascinating that all economics takes for granted this idea that basically utility maxing is just automatically going to give us the best solution for everything. And it's going to make us, it translates directly into happiness. So the utilitarian solution is always the solution that creates the most happiness. For example, they talk about getting more utility. Countries that ultimately derive more utility will have children that grow taller. And so they say, well, so you see, automatically our happiness is tied in with our health and with our utility. And we can measure it, and the people report greater happiness, and that's it. So what is good is increasing the amount of measurable units that we can output and getting more and more efficiency. And the transhuman project ultimately is the project of deriving maximal efficiency, not just from all of our technologies, but from human beings ourselves. Because our idea of inframing technology or inframing pieces and parts of the world around us for use ultimately reflects back upon us, inframes us for use as technology, and we become what Heidegger talks about as a standing reserve, some preset number of units or effort or output that can be gotten to. And in this world picture, in this matrix of nodal networks that sort of creates this flat simulated picture of the world that we ourselves, our physical body, is a part of. But as Giorgiani points out, our consciousness is somehow back away from, disembodied out of the body. And we are kind of like in this sort of virtual world, or we become predisposed to living in this kind of virtual world, a world which is a model that we are distanced out of and looking into as if it was a computer program. And so then we begin to have this predilection for living in a virtual world, in a virtual reality.
Yeah, you're talking about economics. I got to plug in my computer here. You're talking about economics reminds me that I read an economics book maybe 8 years ago, and he's talking about how it's considered to be a paradox in economics that even though wealth and like technological advancement continues to increase, people aren't getting happier, and they see that as a kind of paradox. But really, it's just more of Western, just standard moral bankruptcy and not even understanding how to be happy. They don't know what causes people to be happy. They don't even really understand what happiness is. They just assume like economic prosperity is pretty much synonymous with happiness. Like economists anyway.
Yes.
That's kind of what they're going for.
Because it's measurable. Because it's measurable. And qualities, aesthetics, will really not exactly measurable in the same way that output is. And so we just can't believe that something could be real if it's qualitative or aesthetic. It just has to be totally subjective and therefore not exist at all. And that's the postmodern idea, that an aesthetic is just sort of a part of this giant web, which is entirely relative depending on where you start in that. Whereas we know for certain that this factory outputs 27 tons of screws every day and widgets, precisely. And so that's this kind of thing that we can build this world upon. And we get a model, a giant model as a result. The problem is we end up overlaying that model over our world, over our reality. And eventually the reality itself disappears. Baudrillard calls it the desert of the real. It becomes a meaningless world, and we have this, what he calls hyper reality now, which is this model that we're living in, and we begin to exchange different things in and out of that model as part of this modification project of the Marxists, for example, of this sort of Western bourgeois, white liberal, new Brahmanical managerial caste, a technocratic caste, which wants to sort of stage manage the entire world and to monitor all events everywhere over the surface of the earth in the same way that the Chinese, Giorgiani calls it the Confucian hive mind of the social credit score and everything like that is happening. And so they want to do this, I think, partly as a response to their own ressentiment as intellectuals, their own sort of disgust at nature, at their own nature as well, and this idea that nature is wrong and evil. I've seen this expressed by vegans, right? The idea that when you say, well, this is what happens in nature, they say, I'm better than nature, and I'm no longer a part of nature. And it's humanity's job to transcend nature in the sense that we can create culture, create a hyper reality, which is outside of it, and we can create our own arbitrary system of signs that are torn free from that, and we can live in that virtual reality as we move
And
towards
all of this pretty much, I mean, it involves either ignoring or denying the fact of human nature, which is pretty much the bedrock of our experience. And the left, I mean, they just deny that we even have a human nature. They're going back to Locke's tabula rasa.
Yes.
Because they cannot deal with the fact that we are animals who are just laden with instincts and just reflexes, and we're going to deal with things in a human way, make human assumptions. They just can't deal with that. And transhumanism, I mean, one of the dangers of transhumanism is just trying to force us to be so different from human nature that it's just going to like break us.
Yes, and human nature cannot be acknowledged, and nature cannot be acknowledged by us as well, because it provides this sticking point, this obstacle to the idea that through state management, through state diktat, we can create the Novo Sovieticus, we can create the new Soviet man, basically. We can create a man of the state, a man of the people, and anyone can be created in this perfect image of the state through these programs of education, indoctrination, technological
more
modification.
likely it's going to take computer programs implanted into our brains.
Exactly, right? And so this goes back to Pavlov's ideas with Lenin, and their hope was that they could, because the human being is tabula rasa, because there is nothing inherent or necessary inside of man, that anything can just be installed there. And the more perfect our technology gets, the more perfect we can get towards the completed man, who will ultimately merge, in fact, with other people in a kind of collective thought matrix, a collective hive mind. And that ultimately is quite a scary thing, because your own personal thoughts will not be your own, and in fact can be affected, will be modified, watched, controlled at all times. And we're moving to that, through the social media of everything, and the idea of X that Musk talks about, where he wants to create an everything app, and he's called it move towards the collective consciousness of man, the digital collective consciousness of man. And that's a scary thing for those of us that are a little bit more individualistic, and those that are skeptical about state ideas and state programs. You get this. There was an idea, initially, that human beings had varying levels of natural merit about them, right? And this idea of meritocracy. But ultimately, we move into this other idea where each individual is only their qualifications. Qualifications can be bestowed upon one by the state. And this idea is a world in which there is no inequality. Inequality is a death reminder, inequality is a danger, and inequality is also a reminder of our own failure to individuate and to create ourselves. And so, if we can blame those things on the lack of a state social engineering program, and we can begin to institute those programs, then we can fix the errors of God. We can fix the errors of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, that we see as being evil. And so we can move into this transhuman world as this virtual reality, move into the digital anima, the digital womb, if you will, which is, in a way, I think, a kind of collective suicide, a kind of hope for collective delusion, a world where we will no longer have to be alone ever, where we can soothe all of our existential woes and that feeling of cosmic abandonment and that separation wound inside of us that we get when we begin to individuate in childhood, that so many of us in the society were not able to fix, not able to accomplish. I know at the turn of the last century, Jung said that if something like 80% or 90% of people in a society are unindividuated and therefore they're susceptible to psychic infection and mass madness, we can fix all of those things by feeling the sense of union or reunion, using that which is most readily apprehendable to us, technology, right? In a world where the only thing that's real to us is the quantifiable, the measurable, and the readily obvious rote stimulation.
But the fact remains that, I mean, the first noble truth is going to remain true, that we're all going to suffer, that by eliminating old problems, we're just going to create new ones. But then on the other hand, I mean, like we were saying earlier on, technology is just a relentless one-way force that's moving ahead. And there's various different ways that this transhumanism, I mean, like Elon Musk is already talking about brain implants, which might be like the elites might be able to augment their IQs and be able to learn Spanish, you know, in 20 seconds or some such. The poorer people will probably have some socialized program that gives them sort of a stripped down model for free, but they're going to have to listen to like free advertisements and stuff in their head, you know. That's one possibility, just like physical transhumanism. But then again, it's like already virtual realities. I mean, I've seen enough science fiction movies where some people, you know, it's just the government gives them enough money to keep their body going while they're just spending all their time in this virtual reality. You know, they're off fighting orcs or something, or whatever it is they want to do. And that's another way of just kind of removing people from empirical reality, you know, through a kind of transhumanism. It's just virtual realities. And then, of course, you finally get to the point where you just download the personality of the human into this virtual reality, and there you go. But, I mean, at the same time that this technology is moving forwards, we are getting closer, according to most computer experts, to the technological singularity. And people are trying to predict what's going to happen when the technological singularity occurs, like Ray Kurzweil or whatever, you know, these people that are optimists or whatever, with regard to we're going to live godlike existence because this super intelligent, this super AI is going to just solve all of our problems. You know, it's going to cure all the diseases, and we're just going to live like we're in a heaven realm. But I mean, it's called a singularity because we have no idea what's going to be on the other side of it. It's called a singularity because we cannot even begin to predict realistically what's going to happen after that. It's like the first article I read about the singularity is talking about like recursive self-development in computers, how, you know, they just, once they learn how to like improve upon themselves and increase their knowledge and get better and better on their own, it's going to be an exponential growth. So like the science fiction movies, they just fail utterly because, you know, no artist, no human mind can envision, like can predict what a computer a million times smarter than us would be like. And it's like within a relatively short time with this exponential growth, this super AI, assuming that it occurs, it's going to be as far beyond us as we are beyond insects or amoebas. And so we can't even begin to predict what's going to happen. And that's really that was like the scariest thought of the whole thing. It's like, there's no telling. It could be like Arthur C. Clarke's Brave New World, or not Brave New World, Childhood's End. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's something similar where human beings, like the children of the human race, they start reaching this next stage of evolution where they have like this, they're tapped into this super mind, and they just become like statues. They don't need to eat. They don't even need to breathe anymore. And I mean, they just stand there for years. There's this one scene where these children, just with wild hair all covered with mud, they don't have clothes anymore. They've all rotted off. They've been standing like statues for years in this wilderness. All of a sudden, every living thing around them, all the trees and birds and insects just poof out of existence. And then there's this alien, who's been sort of observing all this. He's explaining to one of the humans there. They reached a certain point in their development where the life around them was becoming a distraction, so they just eliminated it. Just boom. And then they just stand there like statues for another 5 years. And I mean, it's something as incomprehensible as that could happen if we have a computer that becomes 1 billion times more intelligent than we are. I mean, it's like, you just have no idea what's going to happen. But I mean, according to the article that I read, most computer specialists, like the experts, are saying that it's inevitable, assuming that we continue to advance with computer science. And of course, they're not going to stop. It's like a nuclear arms race or something. The Chinese and the West and whoever else, they want to be the first to do it. And some of the scientists are just giddy. They just got stars in their eyes.
Yeah.
They don't really even care if it's right or wrong or it's good or bad or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely not. And again, they are each sort of stage managing a tiny piece of this much larger thing. And that's sort of the moral hazard there. And they're more than willing to keep going on this as far as they possibly can, to the point where they can eliminate all of what we formerly thought to be as sort of metaphysically necessary things in life, right? Like death. The idea of the elimination of death, Heidegger says, is really a problem. You mentioned these beings just sort of standing there for 5 years or whatever. They can just sort of freeze things. You can imagine what a world, well, maybe we can't really imagine, we can try to think about what a world without death would really be like, a world without any suffering either, without disease, without sickness. There would ultimately be no reason for any kind of interaction with anything, with human contact, with nature, no reason at all. And Heidegger says for this reason, death is the uttermost testimonial of being. So without death, it seems like there couldn't really be anything at all. It seems like things would sort of begin to disappear. Baudrillard talks about this as well, right? His essay, I think, which is called "Why Has Everything Not Already Disappeared?" And it is this idea that as the reality breaks apart and we become more and more schizoid, the people, sort of psychically possessed, psychically infected mass man who becomes the last man in this incredible bourgeois frozen life of pseudo comfort and isolation from the other, from any kind of triggering thing that would give them a reminder of anything. They exist less and less. It's almost like they're fading out and reality is disappearing completely. So I'm very skeptical that this is the way forward for us. And I think that actually this is really a form of what I call castratism, this movement to remove potentia and to deaden the sort of masculine possibility, the extension of our will out into the world in order to experience or create, to bring about some new possibility. It's the end of becoming, in other words, is what I'm saying. The advent of this digital catastrophe is the end of becoming. And that is really what the resentful, the intellectuals who are full of ressentiment, who stage manage the world from the Anglo-American establishment. They want to remove and destroy our masculinity, for one thing, because it represents, as they say, violence, the
This
possibility to
danger,
become.
unpredictable danger.
What's that?
Yeah, not just violence, but just danger in general. Just the scariness of the unpredictable. You know,
Right.
somebody that you
That
can't
danger
control.
represents possibility, and it represents becoming, the possibility for something to become, to actualize in the world. And so by virtualizing everything, we freeze everything. We live in a world of simulation and simulacra, as Baudrillard says, where everything is just copies of copies that have lost any sort of original meaning. And what becomes valuable really is just subject to total caprice and whim of the mob at any point. And any day, we create this Faustian money, for example, out of thin air. You know, they have not just Bitcoin, but I mean, literally things that anybody can make up at any time, and their values are totally arbitrary and they go up and down. And then we have, so that's the Faustian money. We have the idea of the Faustian slave, which is I can pull up a computer program and I can review the metrics of millions of people, or you know, women can review me as this portfolio of metrics. Deleuze calls it the dividual, right? So I'm not a human being, rather I am a series of folders, like my credit score, my academic score, my military service, my criminal record, whatever. All of these things, you know, I'm 5'11" and I make this much and I do this, and you know, all of this type of thing, very quantified metrics, because I myself have ceased to be. I myself am actually just a copy. I myself am a simulation living in a simulated world. And this is ultimately a kind of hell, a hell world.
It can never be purely artificial simply because of, I mean, human nature remains a fact. And I do think that there is a certain wisdom in just contenting ourselves to be a kind of upgraded ape that has to eat and shit and sleep and belches sometimes and sweats. I mean, it's limited. I mean, we are a kind of animal, and we're just kind of stuck being a kind of animal. We're stuck being an upgraded ape, but at least we can be content with that and just accept it. Or the other option is go with transhumanism and try and free ourselves of our animal limitations, which would almost certainly require massive brain additives, or else just being, you know, uploaded into a computer or downloaded into a computer.
Yeah, well, it will be.
We wouldn't have physical bodies at all, although we would still feel physical bodies because it would be virtual. But it seems to me that those are like our two options, and either one of them could be wise, I suppose. I mean, some people might see total wisdom in transcending our animal limitations, but I mean, on the other hand, I mean, it can be just as wise, just as enlightened to accept the fact that we are a kind of upgraded ape and we are an animal, and we do have these instincts that are like conditioning our attitudes and our behavior and so forth. We're just a member of the species.
Yeah. Well, it will be the end of humanity, not just as we know it, but completely and utterly. And so the question is, people ask, well, what's so great about humanity anyway? Maybe this is the next stage of evolution. Fukuyama talks about the idea of genetic engineering, removing the temporal dimension to evolution, so that evolution suddenly is no longer a function of time, that we remove time from this function of evolution, and now it can move at an incredibly rapid rate, instantaneously. It can also diverge in an infinity of different directions instantaneously. And so they say, well, this is great, right? But I think that, for me anyway, I have some sort of, even if I'm not able to articulate it perfectly, you know, I have some sort of moral intuition that there's something inherently wrong and evil about this, deeply, deeply evil, in a way that is sinister beyond that which it you know.
Yeah. There are just too many possibilities of shit going wrong. Because we're just like blundering into the unknown to some degree. And assuming the computers, I mean, once they become more intelligent than us, assuming that they even let us still exist, at least, I mean, I do consider it possible that just the next stage in evolution is just going to be like mechanical. It's going to be computers, just AI, artificial organisms or whatever. And I mean, at the very least, there's one consolation, assuming that even if we don't survive, that at least we're sort of like the spermatozoa that have given birth to something that's going to be much greater than we are. Assuming that they become a billion times more intelligent than us. And so
yeah. And that's the sort of, I think, almost religious hope of the people like Kurzweil, right? So the first option, which is to accept that we are, as you say, an upgraded ape, is really sort of like what the crux of Nietzsche's work in the early 20th century was about. It was about the challenge of the coming 20th century, which would be an existential one, would be to try to find existential solutions to these existential problems that go beyond just sort of like reducing everything to technology. But humanity, as he predicted, failed that, right? Humanity, as he says, is a bridge between something else, is a bridge between sort of the ape and the Superman, right? And this is a process which he says is sort of individual in nature, and it involves self-overcoming, and not just self-overcoming, but self-creation, which is even, I think, more terrifying and more deeply disturbing, because it involves a tremendous responsibility. But we have not managed our responsibility. We have not even considered or begun to consider our responsibility towards our relationship with technology and the way that that is affecting us and affecting our world, because this is so new, evolutionarily speaking, and has come about so recently, and it is rapidly changing us, mutating us in ways that we can't possibly understand or imagine. And so our response to that is a very juvenile one, is really to just say, well, we can use this tool to kind of become the Superman, and that'll be it. And hopefully, as you say, we are just this sort of like spermatozoa to something which will just absorb us, take us over, and relieve us of our responsibility, of our existential responsibility in a world without God, in a world of cosmic abandonment. And then we can just live inside of this digital womb forever and be totally annihilated by this devouring mother that we've created. And we'll just live in pleasure and cease to be. And the last thing I'll add on that is this idea of, if we can upload the personality, right? What that again is this veritas idea that we can create a true copy, really is what it is. It becomes true by virtue of being a copy of duplicating, simulating my personality through this series of code. And the question is, once I run that code on the internet, is that really me? And the answer is, of course not. It's not me. I have a spatiotemporal locus. I have all these unique properties, which are then being simulated. But once I die physically, in order to be uploaded into this thing, presumably if I'm not killed in the process of it, then I at least die a natural death regardless. And there is this simulation, this copy of me running. It doesn't think or feel anything. It's just surely like an algorithmic, like a ChatGPT version of me, which we can already kind of do that, right? We can say, hey, ChatGPT, pretend to be so-and-so. It will just be like a much, much greater version of that. This is like the teleportation problem in metaphysics, right? When your atoms get broken down, you are like deconstituted so that they can be moved somewhere else, and then you're reconstituted. Well, you died, right? You're not the same person that you just were. You have all the same memories, and you think you exist, but really you did die at that point. Philip K. Dick talks about this with the do androids dream of redemption too.
But it's like, from the Buddhist point of view, we're dying every moment. It's like we're a different person every moment. Every atom of which we are composed is like blinking in and out of existence. So there is that. But yeah,
No
I
conflict between one moment and the next.
with regard to Star Trek, all you got to do is just send. I mean, they have to send the code as how to reassemble all the atoms. Right? Like in Star Trek, you got the transporter beam. They can't just send all the atoms through space without some way of reassembling them. You'd have to have the vector for like the motion of the vibration of every single particle getting sent there. So I mean, you could just not even bother to send the atoms. You just have like some pigs or something that are sufficient to make up a human being. Just all the necessary atoms. You can just put them together after just getting the code, and then you could start making copies of the person.
I mean, it would be the same thing. You wouldn't need to break me down and then have me go somewhere else, because for all intents and purposes, I mean, that's all you're doing anyway, is just making a copy of the person. So it'll have all of the memories right up until the moment which I am deconstituted, or whatever it is, right up until the moment that it's created. And it really will believe that it's me, and so on and so forth. But if there is anything that carries over, that dies and my life effectively ends in that moment. Or if you just copy it, then then it's just, I'll have a bunch of me running around, except in this case, it'll be virtual, it'll be on the internet, and then that internet will be broadcast out. This is what Kurzweil says, through these vibrations, it will go outward into the universe for eternity, resonating around, and we will seed the universe with this smart dust, and it will be this network of this intelligent dust, like nanomachines, that will be everywhere, that will permeate the universe like spores from a mycelium, like mushroom, or those like things, the little dandelion seeds when you blow on the dandelion and it spreads out everywhere, and that will resonate all of our personalities, our internet, everything, all the knowledge of human history will resonate out through this smart dust forever, and it will create this just godlike being, right? That will just be there, out there forever as evidence that we existed, right? So we said, I came, I was, I am humanity, I am here. And that is our sort of like testament to the universe for eternity.
There is one comforting thought that I have, is that, I mean, I've been reading science fiction since I was a teenager. I especially was reading science fiction before I got turned on to like English lit and serious literature. But I mean, they're making all these predictions, we'd have dome cities under the ocean, and we'd have flying automobiles and everything by the year 2000, and dolphins would be in the United Nations by then, according to Larry and so forth. And most of it just hasn't happened. I mean, to some degree, we haven't really changed all that much, other than just some digital gadgets. But for the most part, things are still, I mean, they're taking their own sweet time. And I do think that ties in with just the Buddhist idea of karma. If we just do not have the karma for an entire species to just radically undergo this transmutation into a kind of cyborg or some sort of virtual entity existing in a computer, that it's just not going to happen. That something's just going to come up to prevent it from happening. I mean, it's like you don't have the karma to hear a certain message, you're not going to hear it. Even if someone tries to tell you, like a loud airplane is going to fly overhead, or whatever, the dog's going to start barking and distract you, and you're just not going to hear it. So I do think that it's possible that the human race is just not unworthy, or not ready, or whatever, for the singularity or just radical transhumanism. And it may be that we're just going to, our civilization apparently is in decline right now anyway, so that technological advancement is going to become more expensive and slow down, and so forth. So it may be that it's just not going to happen.
I mean, this is certainly, before we conclude, an important point to make. I think that it is a possibility that the curve of innovation begins to flatten out and slow, and maybe there is some sort of limit to technology that we are not sure of. In the Techno-Optimist Manifesto, they talk about the idea of, no, technology basically just spirals upward forever, and it always has. But if you study history... What's that?
Intellectual Tower of Babel, trying to just brick by brick build its way up into the heavens of omniscience.
Yeah, and that's again the Hegelian idea. But if you look at history, it really doesn't work that way, right? There are ebbs and flows to technology, and in fact, there are periods where technology is forgotten, actually gets forgotten, including even technology in modern history. We have the idea that NASA has given us, for example, where they've said, actually, because we haven't used these technologies in a while, we're not really able to do the same things that we were back in the 60s and 70s. And so the technology is sort of eroding or has been forgotten because it's not being maintained. And so you actually do have these kinds of ups and downs, because history, I believe, as a pagan, is cyclical, is pulsatile. It doesn't just go in this linear straight line. But again, that gets back into how I tie, Judeo-Christianity and even to some extent Platonism with this idea of a linear history and progress, and a Hegelian idea that we are always progressing and moving towards, the great beyond and the great singularity, that technology is going to take us there. But it may be much more mundane than that. It may in fact be that we are just sort of at the end of this pulsation, and that we are going to kind of taper off into mundanity, and exist there for a long time before the society again begins to sort of ramp itself up. So it may be very much less dramatic, but we all want this kind of millennialist, kind of fun story about the singularity.
Yeah, I think like progressivism, just the belief in progress, social and intellectual and technological and so forth, it reached its peak like in the late 1800s. And it was, people were just believing that, we're just getting better and better. Things are getting better and better. And then it was World War I that hit, that just plunged people into just disillusionment and despair. Yeah.
And romanticism.
Something along those lines next time also, that, our technology is going to get us into such an ugly mess that people are just going to recoil from it. And who knows, maybe we might actually go back to horses and buggies or some such, just as a way of finding some equilibrium, some way of life that's in harmony with human nature enough that we're not just completely like alienated and just living in this state of meaninglessness and so forth.
Lovecraft said, one day, through the probing of science, we will open up such vistas of horror that man will retreat back into the safety of a new dark age.
Well, that's a comforting thought.
Yes, yeah.
Because it'll be the scientists that are looking into the abyss, not us.
Yeah, and that's Frankenstein, and that's the Promethean dream. But sometimes, the Promethean dream becomes a monstrous nightmare, a chimera of warped and aborted potential. So we have to be careful lest we become too hubristic and create another monster. The 20th century is certainly famous for its horrors and its monsters, and hopefully this century will be different. Although
that actually reminds me of something Elon Musk said, where with regard to the whole AI race, trying to develop like super intelligent computers, he says it's like the sorcerer's apprentice, who, you have to have the holy water and the book and everything ready just to make sure that the demon doesn't escape, but they always forget something. They draw the pentagram wrong or something. It's always something, and it's just like playing with disaster, really.
The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Even Stephen Hawking, before he died, he used to say that nuclear war was the greatest threat to the human race. But before he died, the last several years of his life, he was saying, no, it's going to be AI now.
Yeah.
AI is a greater threat to the human race than nuclear war is. Global warming is not even near the top of the list. People are just freaked out about global warming because they're told to be freaked out by it.
Yeah, I strongly agree that AI is the most pressing threat and the greatest danger to humanity. Technology in general is our greatest responsibility, and our relationship with it definitely needs to be evaluated, reevaluated, because we are in this sorcerer's apprentice kind of situation now as a result of our Faustian mindset.
Yeah, and we are upgraded apes, so we do have our
Yes.
limitations. We can do our best, but that's no guarantee that everything is going to come out well.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
So
thank you.
yeah, if you don't have anything concluding to say, we
I
can
think
wrap it.
that's about it. I think I covered just about everything.
Yeah, yeah, you were in depth. You were giving like the whole philosophical groundwork for the whole idea of it, which I appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I've thought about a lot. So I appreciate you giving me the platform to say it and the ability to pry it forth out
All
of
right.
me as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have it uploaded onto YouTube before Halloween because this is the Halloween special after all.
Yes. Oh, good, good. My
All
mom
right.
will be happy.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna end this
Yes.
recording here.
Thank you to everyone for watching.